So let's start out with a quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj, where he says, "Totally apart from whatever seems to be happening, when one stops thinking that one is living and gets the feeling that one is being lived, that whatever one is doing is not doing, but one is made to do, then that is a sort of criterion of non-dual awareness." Did I read that right? I think so, yeah. So, beautiful quote, right? He's really talking about the, releasing the sense of agency and noticing that the world is doing all the work and you're not doing any of the work. Interesting, beautiful quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj. Okay, so what is non-dualism? Everyone has a quick, easy answer for that, right? Anybody here want to jump up with their quick, easy answer about what is non-dualism?
Oneness.
Oneness, okay. So it's not two, it's one. Pretty good definition. What else? It's a hard thing to talk about, right? Hard thing to, everyone will get in your face about various definitions or why you're wrong with your definition, et cetera, et cetera. But in the simplest way of looking at it, we could say that there is an experience called non-dualism, or non-dual experience, and there is a philosophy about that experience. We could get into a lot of discussion about whether it's actually an experience or not, but that's part of the philosophy, right? So that leads us to the other side. It's either something's happening to a human being, or we can talk about something that's happening to a human being. So there's sort of these two aspects, right? There's a history of experience, and then there's a history of talking about that experience. And which do you think came first? I'm really asking for answers.
Experience.
Probably the experience, right? And in fact, that experience could go back to, Australopithecus or something, as far as we know. I mean, we have no idea, right? I mean, writing is only about 5,000 years old. So we just don't know. We can assume, we can make assumptions, or we can go philosophical, and remember this is philosophy now, and say, oh, that experience has always been there. It's timeless, it has no beginning and no end. But in terms of the normal course of human history and the way we think about it when we're, talking to other people in a normal way, we would say, well, it's probably been going on as long as there's people, at least, as long as there have been people. However, writing about it, that experience, and talking about that experience is much more recent. In fact, it took people a really long time to figure out how to talk about this experience and write about it. And thousands of people writing back and forth for thousands of years were required to bring this concept into some kind of clarity for humans when they wanted to talk about it. Right? Again, different from the experience. So everyone clear that we're talking about two different things here. It's a human experience. Again, we can fight about whether it's an experience or not, but that's a philosophical argument. There's an experience, and then there's talking about the experience. We don't know how long the experience has been going on, but the subject of the talk is how long writing about it has been going on, and how, and this is the interesting point for me, this didn't just jump fully formed into human words that were clear and crisp and understandable to everybody. We're still having a hard time talking about it, right? It's a difficult thing to talk about. So one of the things that humans have been doing for thousands of years is trying to figure out how to talk about this. And of course you can say, well, it's impossible and we shouldn't try to talk about it, and that is one position. However, that doesn't really get us anywhere when we're talking about the history of trying to talk about it, does it? So we're going to stick with that part. And what I think is interesting is that just like humans have evolved, just like civilizations have evolved, just like language evolves, everything evolves, gets more complex, more precise, more intricate, more interesting. The philosophy of non-dualism and the way of talking about the experience of non-dualism and the writing about non-dualism and humans, gabbing to each other about this thing that they're going through that's really blowing their minds, that has evolved too. It started out very crudely, and over time it's gotten much, much more advanced. We're getting better at talking about it. Sometimes I think conferences like this might be a big part of learning how to talk about it, as we all sort of get, instead of being just, you know, stuck in our own little corner with our own little way of talking about this, we meet other people who talk about it in different ways, and it opens us up to new viewpoints. So over time, this idea has evolved, and I think that's quite interesting. So where does it start? Where do we first hear about non-dual experience? Not in the Vedas, but in India is probably the oldest writings that we can, you know, clearly say have something to do with it. Again, the experience is probably happening all over the world to all kinds of people all the time since the beginning of before time. But the first place they make a concerted effort to make any sense about this experience is India, okay? So in order to talk about that, we start always with the Vedas, right? So everybody know what the Vedas are. I don't even have to cover it. We're all clear about the Vedas. There's a lot of nodding, actually. Fascinating. Okay, so let's just say that the Vedas start about 3000 BC, and these are poems in a very ancient form of Sanskrit. They're probably composed by many different authors. In Indian languages, in Sanskrit, you would refer to them as Shruti Smriti, right? Which would mean that which has been heard and that which has been remembered. In other words, it's their way of saying it's channeled or, you know, experience. It's poems that come from a, you know, divine source that have been written down. They've been heard and then they've been written down and remembered. However, when we read these poems, which are incredibly beautiful, they're basically spells, rituals, incantations, and ceremonies for basically going to heaven. Okay, so we can compare this to something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead or these other early texts that are really about very dualistically constructed. I'm going to do something to get merit, to go to heaven. And interestingly, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in the Vedas, the idea is it runs out after a while. You know, you do all this stuff, your soul goes to heaven, but after you've used up the merit from all the stuff you did, you come back, right? You're cast out of heaven, you're done with your merit, and where do you end up? Back on Earth, right? So that's where we get the idea of reincarnation. So the Vedas are very dualistic and concerned with this kind of thing. They're also really beautiful. Some of the stuff we, you know, in spiritual traditions deal with, experience, enjoy, work with, make part of our practice every day comes from the Vedas. Anybody got an example? Name, so anybody do any Hindu stuff in here? Right, so Gayatri Mantra, right? Om Bhurabhuvah Swaha Tat Savitur Varanyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhyo Yo Na Prachodayat, right? From a Veda. Same with the Mahamrityunjaya mantra. These are from the Vedas and people still use it all the time and they're written all over the walls in India and so on. So that's kind of the foundation. But people took these ideas and over thousands of years they kept working them. And some of this working was done publicly by priests and with writings and so forth. And some of it was done very privately by seekers in forests, right? An interesting thing about India and of course other countries is that there's people who go out in the forest and examine their own experience. So over the years, people went out in the forests of South Asia and they examined their experience and they started writing about that from their own viewpoint, or at least from the viewpoint of their own experience rather than a ritual context. And those writings, there's at least 200 of them, although classically we would say there's 108, and are called Upanishads. Okay? And Upanishad literally means sitting beside. So these are like meant to be verbally transmitted from the teacher to the student who is sitting beside him. It's very personal, it's very intimate, and Upanishads are probably written by one person about their own experience. And this is where we start to get this investigation into what's going on. And an interesting thing at India at that time, which was started about 600 BCE, is that there were just crowds of guys doing this, mainly men, but women also, like a lot of people going out, investigating their experience, and then what would they do? They get together in hostels, they get together in roadhouses and inns, they would get together in, public squares, and what would they do? They would talk about it and debate it. Okay? They actually, there's this rich tradition of hanging out and talking about what this all meant. So who is the number one person who we know today that emerged from this tradition? There's an extremely famous human being that was one of these guys. That is correct. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was one of these guys. And really had a lot to say about his experience. Okay? And it is here that we get some of the first really solid inklings about non-dualism. Okay, I bring up the Upanishads. We're going to come back to them. Just don't forget that they exist. But it's in the early Buddhist writings that we get people talking about what today we would call non-dualism. I don't think there's any point in any of the early Buddhist canon where they ever use the term non-dual. It's just not a Buddhist word. Okay, we'll talk about where it comes from in a minute. But what they do talk about is no self. Okay, anatta. And the idea that, the self that you think you have is composed of parts, and if you look deeply into that construction, it falls apart. Right? It is not a solid thing. No soul, anatta, no self. So the interesting thing is that early conception of no self is kind of dualistic, right? In the sense that, and of course this is Buddhist heresy, but to say this, but we're talking in an academic way. So looking at it as philosophically, early Buddhism had the separation between samsara, the world, and nirvana, the experience of no self, right? And that was a dualistic separation. There's the horrible world that you're trapped in, full of suffering and pain, contrasted with nirvana, what we might call non-dual experience. Okay, so he's starting to talk about this, but it's still, at least, we can all probably agree that we're just guessing here, but we can all probably agree the Buddha's experience was perfectly non-dual, but the way he was talking about it was still kind of, in development. They're still having trouble kind of really formulating the right words to get this idea across. So they start out talking with no self, all right? But as Buddhism, like everything else, evolved, right? It evolved, it got more complex. People talked to each other. They were having deep experiences. They were trying to describe their experiences to each other. They wrote texts, and people wrote commentaries on those texts. 1,000 years passed, and we get Middle Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism. And we get a new term called emptiness. All right? We get a new term called emptiness, or shunyata. And shunyata, or emptiness, is the first really full description of non-dualism. When you read a text talking about emptiness, it is very clear that they're talking about non-dual awareness. It is incredibly plain, okay? And what's interesting is that no self is mainly an experience. The Buddha did an interesting thing of calling things no self and calling them, called them impermanent suffering and no self as an adjective, one single adjective. So it's used in a very interesting, unusual way. But we get the idea that he keeps trying to describe this experience. Whereas 1,000 years later, when we've got a religion called Buddhism that has writers and people, giving talks and lectures and sermons, you get this idea eventually called emptiness. And that is a philosophical concept. Right? It's referring to an experience, but it is a philosophical concept. And what is the concept? It's very related to no self. Some people think it's identical. But the idea is that essentially nothing has an essence, okay? Since the beginning of time, humans have this sort of biological intuition that things have essences. And no self was one of the first descriptions that maybe that's not such an accurate intuition. But emptiness is a full description of that intuition, right? Things are empty. There's nothing you can look at that has, there's no Platonic essence behind anything. It all dissolves when you deconstruct it. It's a philosophy of deconstruction. What's the ultimate expression, the simplest, deepest, some would say most significant expression of the philosophy of shunyata or emptiness? It's the Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra, right? Very, very short, very succinct, super pithy sutra. Anybody ever heard that sutra? Prajna Paramita Hridaya, right? Heart of Perfect Wisdom. And in the Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra, there is an extremely intense, pithy, short phrase, or two phrases, depending, that says form is emptiness and emptiness is form, right? There it is. Nothing you can see is not empty, and even emptiness comes into being as form, right? So there we have people talking about non-dualism in a very clear way. Questions? Quickly, before I move on. Okay. Coming out of this sort of evolution of the idea of non-dualism, we get the philosophy called Chittamatra, which is mind-only philosophy. Because there's different ways of understanding. Am I being loud enough, sir? Can you hear me okay? Louder would be good. No, he doesn't want me to move that. All right. They're going to turn me up. Up here, it sounds really loud. Okay, so there's a lot of, good, thank you. There's a lot of complications in these philosophies, like what does it mean? Is the world real? Is the world not real? Is there God? Is there not God? Is there a self? Is there not a self? So all of these, there's possible non-dual versions of all those ideas. But one of the main ones that came forward in this middle period of Buddhism is the mind-only philosophy, which is Chittamatra, which literally means mind is the mother. And the idea here is something that we'll all be pretty familiar with if we're at a non-dualism conference. And the Chittamatra, in the most reductive way of talking about it, is just the world is a dream. The world is absolutely a dream. Okay, there's nothing outside of the mind. Okay, so this becomes a central tenet of, for example, Zen Buddhism. This is still the basic philosophy. The world is a dream, and we just have to recognize that dream. So that's one way of understanding non-dualism, although it's not the only one. In Tibetan Buddhism, what's it called? Almost pretty similar thing, Rigpa. Right? Rigpa is the primal, pure, ever-free, utterly open, infinite basis of all consciousness. That's the same mind that Chittamatra is talking about. Right? In Tibetan Buddhism, in the Tibetan language, it's called Rigpa. So a lot of Buddhism likes this concept, okay, that the world is a dream. However, in Tibetan Buddhism, it's not that the world doesn't exist, right? Whereas in Chittamatra, the idea is the world is literally does not exist. So what's interesting in all this is where's the word non-dual? Doesn't exist, right? This isn't the science and Rigpa conference. This isn't the science and Chittamatra conference, is it? We're calling it the science and non-dualism conference. Why? It's a word that comes much later as the philosophy gets more advanced. And just because we're dealing with Buddhism, we'll quickly talk about the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, which only exists these days in Chinese, because the Sanskrit version is lost. But interestingly, that this whole sutra explicitly talks about non-dualism the whole time. And the entire point of, I love these later tantras and sutras where It's like hundreds of bodhisattvas, enlightened beings, are sitting around discussing this stuff, and they're asked a question and they're trying to answer the question together, you know. And so the question of this sutra is, you know, what's non-dual awareness? And so they all give different answers. Like the Bodhisattva Dharma Vikravana says, for example, now he's giving his answer to, you know, the interlocutor who's also a bodhisattva, and saying production and destruction are two, but what is not produced and does not occur cannot be destroyed. Thus, the attainment of tolerance of the birthlessness of things is entrance into non-duality, right? Simple concepts, stuff never gets born, so it never dies. That's non-dual awareness. But the Bodhisattva Sriganda says something different. He says, I and mine are two, you know, things I own. If there is no presumption of a self, there won't be possessiveness, and thus the absence of presumption of the self is the entrance into non-duality. Okay, different answer, different concept, obviously related, but different. Third Bodhisattva, these are just some examples. Sri Kuta declares, defilement and purification are two. When there is a thorough knowledge of defilement, there will be no conceit around purification. The path leading to complete conquest of all conceit is the entrance into non-duality. Why is he talking that way, by the way? Why is he talking about defilement and purity? Well, it's actually early Buddhism, right? They're always talking about defilements and kleshas and getting rid of the defilements so you can go to nirvana. This is, you know, later Buddhism, so he's explicitly critiquing that and saying, well, that's dualistic. And we're going to say that non-dual philosophy is, gets rid of that. But yes. So what's interesting is this goes on and on and on like these. It's a very long sutra. It's very beautiful. They use it in China as like as poetry, you know. But in the end, Manjushri, who I think answered the question in the first, no, it was a crown prince asking the question. So Manjushri, of course, the wisdom Buddha, gives the best answer and says to the other Buddhas, you know, good sirs, you have all spoken well. Nevertheless, all your explanations are themselves dualistic. So he, you know, they're going up the baseball bat. On top does the eagle claw on top of the baseball bat and says, to know that no one is teaching to express nothing, to say nothing, to explain nothing, to announce nothing, to indicate nothing, and to designate nothing. That's really the entrance into non-duality. So he just blows them all out of the water, and the fact that they're even speaking at all is dualistic. So, okay. And so that's the one place in Buddhism where they actually talk explicitly using the term Advaita, although it's in Chinese, so we're just assuming it's Advaita. All right. So, remember those Vedas and Upanishads. The Upanishads, if you remember the dates I gave, go from 600 BCE to 600 CE. So we've got 1,000 years of Upanishads. So what's happening over those 1,000 years? Stuff's developing, stuff is evolving. The conversation is happening between all these people. They're learning how to talk about it better, right? Buddhism has come into the scene, and we've had 900 years of Buddhism at this point. So what do the Hindus do? You know, the country's mixed with a lot of religions. But it's not like they were that separate. I mean, if you go to the caves at Ajanta or actually Ellora, which are gorgeous and I recommend, they're tantric from the tantric period, but here's the caves of all the Buddhist tantrics, and without missing a beat, without even any separation, there's literal doors. You get to the caves of the Hindu tantrics, right? So they're like a couple feet apart, they're right together. And then off on the end of the Hindu tantrics are the caves of the Jain tantrics. So all these people were completely talking to each other all the time. It's not like there was some kind of, you know, it's a little less gnarly than in the West with our religious discussions. They were into religious discussion and rather than persecution. So they talked about it a lot. And so what you start to get are Hindu interpretations of the Upanishads that make them sound Buddhist. So this is really fascinating. Okay, but we get this term Advaita from, not from Buddhism, but from Hinduism. Anybody want to tell me what Advaita means? Not two, right? So in English, non-dual. And boy, I'm getting a wave here, so I'm really going to have to hurry. So yes, we get at 600 AD, 600 CE, a guy called Gaupada going back and reinterpreting Upanishads to show how they're non-dual. So one of the first ones, this is not Gaupada talking, is the Nonduality Upanishad. And there they talk about, there's two ways of talking about non-dualism. One is a positive way, like the self or the mind or the Buddha nature is everything. And in Latin, that'd be called via positiva. And Nonduality Upanishad does that. For example, the wise man beholds all things in the self and the self in all beings. For that reason, he does not hate anyone. To the seer, all things have verily become the self. What delusion, what sorrow can there be for him who beholds that oneness? Right? So it's saying that the mind is everything, just like Chittavatra. Another text that does that same thing. Now you may have seen this Sanskrit, or you may have heard the English translation of this Sanskrit in, for example, important books by like Nisargadatta Maharaj, right? Tat Tavam Asi is the Sanskrit. What does it mean? I am that, thou art that. It's the same idea. Everything you see is just your own mind. So it's a very strong, positive, in quotes, description of non-dualism. Then there's also this impronounceable Upanishad. I call it the impronounceable Upanishad. The great forest text, Brihadaranyaka. I think I said that right. And this is a version of the other way of talking about non-dual experience, which is that the self is nothing, right? The world is nothing. It's the way of saying it's all a dream. And this Upanishad is where we get another super famous thing we're always talking about in non-dual circles, which is neti neti, right? Not that, not that. Very famous practice of looking at everything in the world and just going, well, it ain't that. So we get this from this unpronounceable Upanishad. So the main one, however, is the Mandukya Upanishad. This is the one that Gaupada in 600 CE interprets non-dualistically. So whether this thing was actually non-dual or not, he goes back and writes an entire giant book describing how it is non-dual, a giant text. Okay, and then he's using the word Advaita. And what's interesting is, of course, he's using tons of Buddhist language and tons of Buddhist concepts because that's where the discussion had been brought forward the most. So he, just like any other thing, if gene sequencing technology develops in America, then when Germany wants to use gene sequencing technology, they have to use American terms for a while till they do get their own terms. So because Hinduism is starting to talk this way, they're using Buddhist terms at first. But it's very clear that he's talking about Buddhism, talking about non-dualism, and he has this theory called non-origination. Again, nothing is ever born, nothing ever dies. That's his big idea. And then I'm going to really hurry through this. His student, or actually the student of his student, so it's like his spiritual grandson, is Shankara, probably the most famous modern Hindu. Vast proponent of Advaita, went north, south, east, and west in India, founding temples and founding monastic orders and removing impurities, a child prodigy in Sanskrit, always getting in fights with pundits and blowing their minds and having their wives prove him right. He's a cool guy. But anyway, he wrote a book, and his book is called The Crest Jewel of Discrimination. And in that book, he summarizes the entire, this is the guy who really brings Advaita forward. Like, this is why we ever use the word. And why we're here in America using a weird word like Advaita. It's because of Shankara. And He has a Sanskrit statement from the Crest Jewel of Discrimination text that he wrote, and it goes thusly. Brahma satyam jagat mitya jivo brahmeva na para. Brahma is the only truth, the world is an illusion, and in the final analysis, there ain't no difference between Brahman and Atman, you and God, right? So this is an example of a God-based version of Advaita, right? Brahman. So everything after that is modern people interpreting this guy. And that is why we know about Advaita. There's so much to say about this, and I'm getting the 5-minute thing there. So what I will do now is just summarize by saying there's Western non-dual traditions in all the Western religions. It mainly evolved separately, but you can tell that there was a lot of overlap here and there. But humans have been working a long time to develop the means, you might say the technology, to talk about this really important experience.
Thank you, Michael Taft.